Okay, let's go ahead and get started. First thing I'd like to do is welcome everybody to day 3 of the formal presentations and symposia for this year's meeting of the Tennessee Valley Interstellar Workshop and Starship Century and Tau Zero Foundation. I think we've had a pretty good week so far. Do you all agree it's been a death march? I hope it's been worth it. Yeah. I know we have a pretty full schedule for our last day today. We're going to begin with this panel. We'll then break and go into our plenary session this morning, lunch, split sessions this afternoon. Then we have our working tracks. We'll regroup, and please come back toward the end of the day because we're going to be outbriefed on each of the working tracks and the products they produced this week. And then Paul Gilster, raise your hand, Paul, has been taking notes, and as he will undoubtedly do for his Centauri Dreams blog, Paul is going to give us his summary of the meeting and the takeaway points that we can take from that. And also, don't forget, we're not finished then. After dinner, please come back in because we have our science fiction writers panel tonight. If you have your copies of the books by some of these writers to get autographed, bring them with you. If an author refuses to sign a book, I don't think I'll invite them back. So they need to be able to sign their books. And these are all authors that many of you know very well. So if you don't have a chance to get their book yet, I'm sure the local Barnes & Noble might be able to sell it for you. And there might be some books here for sale tonight, although I haven't heard the final word on that yet. Don't count on it. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and go into our morning panel. We have some very, very special guests with us today. And I'm actually still amazed that we were able to get the people we have up on the stage to talk to this group. I'm very humbled by that and very appreciative of you gentlemen taking your time to be with us today. What we're going to do is the format is I'll make introductions. I'll then hand it off to Pete Klupar, who is the chief engineer for the whole of Breakthrough Initiatives, who has some questions for our panelists about the topics that we care about. The settlement, exploration, development of space, and our steps toward becoming an interstellar species. And these folks are some visionaries in leadership positions, and I think they're going to have some interesting things to share with us. After those questions that Pete has pre-prepared, we're going to open it up to you in the time we have available for a few questions. You must, you're pointing, the microphone? Yeah, that's right. And in not raising hands, when it comes time for the Q&A from here, if you would please line up in the microphone and speak into the microphone, we'll take as many questions as we can. Please also remember we have the hearing assistive devices in the back for anybody who needs that. Yes, John? Okay, only this microphone over here is hot, so you'll need to go to the one on the right if you'll have questions at that time. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists. I'll be very brief. They will have an opportunity to make some opening remarks before we get into the question and answer. To my immediate left is, in my day job, my boss, Dr. Paul McConnaughey. He is the Associate Director of the Marshall Space Flight Center here for NASA. Then we have Representative John Culbertson from Texas. And I've learned this morning, he is one of us. He is definitely bullish about space and space exploration. And you may recognize his name from language that was going toward NASA, directing NASA to start looking at interstellar exploration. And I'm sure he'll have a few words to say about that. Next, we have our local Congressman, Mo Brooks, the Honorable Mo Brooks. He is also one of us. How could he be in Huntsville and not be one of us, right? He has been representing this district for a few years now, definitely a space advocate and someone who is bullish about the future and where we're going in space. And last, I'd like to reintroduce General Kwast, Stephen Kwast. General Kwast spoke with us last year, gave one of our plenary lectures when we were in Chattanooga. I've heard from many people that was one of the best lectures we had at our last meeting. We're extremely pleased to have him come back and join us today on this panel and to share his vision for the future in space and the various roles that the various parts of government as well as industry will be playing in that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Pete Klupar, who's going to take over the agenda.
Thanks, Les. I did want to add my my welcome to the panelists, and thank you very much for your dedication to this interstellar problem. It's an important issue that we all work on, and I really appreciate the dedication and energy you guys put into it. It's quite remarkable. But would like to start with some opening comments. So I'd just like to go down the row here and start with Paul. And would you please give us 5 minutes of discussion?
So thank you, Pete. So I'm Paul McConnaughey, Associate Director of Technical at NASA Marshall Space Flight Center. I got a few slides to share with you about where we are, but I think what we have is basically some data that talks about really how we are going first steps towards interstellar exploration at NASA, and it's quite an exciting time for us. So with the first chart, I'm sure you're all aware of that NASA is currently developing the Space Launch System. This is a super heavy launch vehicle capable of sending humans into deep space. It's a unique capability supporting the government requirement for lunar and Mars exploration, and it really was built for putting large payloads with humans into space. So it's quite exciting, and you see there on the lower left-hand side the Mars missions. So we're looking at putting anywhere from 20 to 40 metric tons of lander on Mars, a total of 500 metric tons for a mission. And it certainly would be a challenge. We found out yesterday at the National Space Council announcement we'll be looking at a cislunar environment and moving in for a permanent presence on the moon and then onto Mars. What you see in SLS and Orion is very consistent with that direction. But an interesting thing happened on the way to Mars. The science community did some analysis on SLS, and they found that a vehicle with that much throw capability could put very interesting science payloads deep into space very quickly. So consequently, we worked with the folks at JPL, and they developed the Europa Kuiper capability. This is a mission that will fly in the 2022-2024 timeframe. It will be flying in SLS for the primary reason that it can do the mission very quickly. In a conventional approach, it would take a 7.5-year mission trip time to Europa. With SLS, we're looking at 2.5 years and effectively completing the mission in 6 years. That may not sound like much, but if you're a planetary scientist, it's a very big deal because that means you can complete 1, 2, maybe even 3 missions in your lifetime at that flight rate and that capability. So the fact that you can put the payloads out there very quickly and get to your time on science very quickly is a huge paradigm change for this planetary science community. So going from Mars and then going on to Europa, how do we then move on to Interstellar? And so there's a couple key aspects of that involve both SLS and advanced technology. So next chart, please. So in terms of advanced technology, we're looking at how do you move things quickly or efficiently in space. And there you see in the upper right-hand corner, nuclear thermal propulsion. We're actually using that as a trade study. We're actually doing risk reduction to how we use that vehicle for Mars. We're looking at a 25,000 pound thrust vehicle that has twice the efficiency of a chemical propulsion that will move humans very quickly back and forth between Mars. The spin-off is it can also move scientific payloads very deep, very quickly to the outer solar system and into the interstellar environments. We're also going to be flying a solar sail. You see that on the left-hand side there. That will be a 6U CubeSat that will be deployed on the first flight of SLS in 2019. After deployment of this CubeSat in the translunar environment, we'll deploy the solar sail, and we'll have a nice journey, a 2-year journey to a near-Earth asteroid. So after getting near the near-Earth asteroid, we'll then do some prox ops, do some photographs, do some spectral analysis, but it'll really be a first demonstration of a almost 90 square meter solar sail moving under solar power to a near-Earth asteroid rendezvous. And in the lower right-hand corner, you see there a similar sort of concept, but instead of a solar sail, it is an electronic sail, an e-sail we call it, and it is looking at a series of deployed wires like a spoke. So you see a wires like a spoke that's like 40 kilometers in diameter in space. Once you charge each one of those wires, you'll have a positive charge, And with the positive charge, then the solar winds, the protons from the solar winds, then push that vehicle across space. We're expecting to see as much as 10 AU per year capability with this motor. So these are the type of things we have going on in space. In addition, I'll remind you, the paradigm change associated with solar electric propulsion on the order of 20 to 15 years ago, it really was a technology. Now it is our bread and butter transportation for satellites in space, and we on the human spaceflight side are now upping the ante up to 40, 100, 150 kilowatt systems to move satellites around in space. So the next chart. So how do we put all this together? With SLS, these advanced technologies, where do we move on to Interstellar? And we're currently studying 3 missions, potential missions. There's the joint projects between JPL, APL, Boston University, Caltech, University of Alabama, Huntsville, a number of folks involved. And the first one is the Interstellar Medium Explorer. And what we're doing there is we're taking a spacecraft and we're putting on a heavy thermal protection system. In fact, it's the same thermal protection system that will be flying on the Solar Probe Plus. So that's a very protected system, and we're actually going to do a combination of heliophysics mission near the sun and then send that vehicle into interstellar space. So we'll do that by launching off Earth, and you see there in the little circle there's our little trajectory. We'll launch off Earth, then we'll come back and do a gravity assist flyby off Earth. Then we'll go off and do a gravity assist flyby off Europa. Then we come back and do the Oberth maneuver, which means we gravity assist and a burn off the sun, and our trajectory coming off the sun is 13 AU. Now that's pretty exciting because 13 AU per year means that once I do my heliophysics, I then can see the outer solar system, and I'm into interstellar space on the order of 10 years. Now again, that's really exciting. Voyager took 40 years to get there. That's more than a scientist's career, but now we're looking at potential interstellar missions on the order of 10 years to get into the interstellar environment for exploration. Next chart. We'd use it. I don't know the answer to that, but I can get back to that. So the question is, how far away to Alpha Centauri? I don't think we'll get there in my lifetime, but we'll talk about that. 2,000 AU?
2,000 AU?
2,000 AU.
250.
250 out.
It's a lot further than that.
So the answer is about 200 years.
Yeah.
But it's a start. But it's a start. So talking 13 AU per year, that is a paradigm changer for how we're doing planetary exploration. Okay, so we take the same sort of approach and we apply it to what we can do about exploring our outer solar system. And there's a proposal for a Kuiper Belt Explorer. We'll look at launching the same trajectory, but instead of going towards interstellar, we then move towards the what they call dwarf planets out in the Kuiper Belt region. It'd be Makemake and Kauai. We can probably catch both those planets at a particular time if we launch in the mid-2020 regime. Again, looking at this, and the trip time on this would be on the order of 3 to 4 years. Significant saving in terms of finding dwarf planets that we've never seen before. Next chart, please. This is the most interesting thing we can do, and it really has changed the way we're thinking about exploration. People have known for a while about the solar gravitational lens. And this is basically a bending of electromagnetic waves that allow us to use that bending to magnify the vision of exoplanets across the universe. So the proposal is that there's this focal area out there on the order of 500 to 550 AU away. Once we get in that focal area, we can then aim at an exoplanet and get to the point where we actually see the clouds on that exoplanet. Now, 550 AU away with that 13 AU capability with the SLS mission, we can combine that and we could actually get on that focal plane in approximately 40 years. So that puts us in the Voyager type time frame where we can actually begin interstellar out in this focal plane at 500 AUs and then get a close-up view of an exoplanet. So that's very exciting. We're working with the JPL folks. The technology there is obviously making a spacecraft last for 40 years, getting to that point, and then how you do the integration of the spectrum with a telescope. So these are all exciting areas. The next chart, please. The point of telling you this is today's topic is really first steps. And the message here is we really are there with first steps. We have a heavy launch capability. That is a paradigm changer which allows exploration of the outer planets and interstellar regime, and we're on the path to look at those missions, and we'll see them proposed to the agency fairly soon.
Thank you very much, Paul. Congressman, you've led the way in interstellar or space exploration.
Thank you.
Have some comments you'd like to?
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be with you this morning. I'm John Culbertson. I chair the subcommittee on appropriations that funds NASA, and agreed to serve on the appropriations committee primarily because I wanted to be here on this subcommittee to restore NASA, lift them above and beyond the glory days of Apollo. As a native Houstonian, I grew up with those astronauts as my heroes as a kid. Always, it broke my heart to see the end of the Apollo program, and the shuttle retired, and anxiously awaiting and aggressively working with Mo Brooks' help to fund the SLS and to get humans back into space on an American-built rocket. And pleased to report that NASA's back on track. Level of funding that we've been able to achieve is that NASA's now at the highest level of funding they've ever had in the history of the agency. There's strong bipartisan support for NASA and Congress. Tremendous amount of support for the mission, for the vision that the administration has laid out for us to return to the moon and then go beyond with humans. I think it's important to think of NASA's role in the new era of space exploration we've entered into, to think of the commercial sector as catching a cab out in front of your office building to go to a nearby location, that you'll have a variety of commercial providers to get you into low Earth orbit, whether it be cargo or an experiment or to take humans into low Earth orbit. But NASA's role will then be deep space travel, sort of the interplanetary highway system provider, to go interplanetary and then interstellar. And the investment that's going to require is going to take a significant investment to make sure that all these dreams of the future come true. And as a amateur astronomer, a sort of a self-taught amateur astronomer and an avid follower of the work of NASA and the American Academy of Sciences, I understood years ago that the decadal survey I always felt was sort of the gold standard when it came to identifying the top priority missions that NASA should pursue each decade. But as I learned, NASA was not necessarily following that. So as I built up seniority in the Appropriations Committee on the Commerce, Justice, Science Committee, and was finally in a position to become chairman of the full committee last Congress, I wrote into law that NASA must follow the recommendations of the decadal survey in each of the major areas, heliophysics, astrophysics, earth sciences, planetary science, in order to map out a blueprint that the scientific community would get behind and support. So that's now written into law in my appropriations bill. Second thing I became aware of is that as a part of that decadal survey, the planetary community has recommended last decade, this decade, their highest priority mission was a mission to Europa. It's the saltwater ocean, worldwide saltwater ocean. As many of you know in this room, that the ocean of Europa is about 100 kilometers deep. There's a free-floating ice shell. We now know from the Cassini mission, which just ended on September 15th, that the ocean world of Saturn, Enceladus, which also has a worldwide ocean and a free-floating ice shell. The ocean of Enceladus is venting continuously into space, and Cassini discovered that salt water has been hydrothermally altered, and therefore it's being drawn into and ejected from hydrothermal vents on the bottom of the Enceladus's ocean, just as occurred here on Earth. That's undoubtedly happened on Europa. We see from Hubble that there's vents, water is venting into space from the ocean of Europa. The scientific community last decade, this decade, wanted to see NASA go to Europa and as the most likely place we're going to find life. And I'm convinced that it's going to take a civilization-level discovery in order to transform in the mind, throw a switch in the mind of the public to make the investment necessary to make all these dreams that all of us share for NASA come true. And I'm convinced that civilization level discovery is going to be the discovery of life on another world, most likely in the oceans of Europa. So out of frustration and a commitment to see NASA's investment reach that next level, I wrote into law with Mo's help and the help of my colleagues, wrote into the Commerce Justice Appropriations Bill a statutory requirement that NASA must go to Europa. They have to orbit the moon, and they have to land on the surface. So the Europa Orbiter and Lander is the only mission it is illegal for NASA not to fly, I'm pleased to report. And has to be done. And it was a natural marriage with SLS because it does require getting there pretty rapidly. It's going to require a really big payload. I think the fairing is 8.5 meters.
It's 8.4.
8.4 meters, so you're going from 4 meters on the...
4 to 8.4. 4 meters up to 8.4.
4 meters, right, to 8 point. That's a big payload. So the SLS is extraordinarily capable. Not only get you there in a rapid, very rapidly, but it can carry these huge scientific payloads in a deep space very, very quickly. In the course of this, I also created the Ocean Worlds program to direct NASA to design missions to take us to not only explore the oceans of Europa, but to go to Enceladus and to Titan using SLS. So that's all written into law and funded. We just passed the CJS appropriations bill out of the House about a month or so ago, late July. And so what I just described to you is now written into federal law and funded. Now, that mission, that the Klupar, will launch in 22. JPL is now putting together the lander concept. Everything's going beautifully. It looks like that's going to come together very nicely. They're going to land near a vent using the sky crane technology they used on the Mars Science Laboratory. And as they're coming down into land, I asked them if they're going to, I think, be able to do this as well. Because the vents on Enceladus are permanently open, I'm convinced, may I borrow your pen, Mo?
Help yourself.
I asked them if they could, as they're coming down, using one of the arms on the sky crane, as they fly over one of those vents, if they couldn't just drop one into the...
I want it back.
Yeah, you want it back. Drop one... drop a probe into one of those open cracks, because I want to get into that ocean in our lifetime and see what it's like. Now, that discovery, I think, is going to electrify the public and allow us to make the investments that are necessary to take NASA to the next level. And that next level is also mapped out in my CJS bill. I've also directed NASA to identify the nearest Earth-like planet around the nearest star using wonderful technology called Starshade and WFIRST, the next generation telescope that NASA is building. Starshade is designed to occult the central star of nearby stellar system, spectroscopically fingerprint the atmosphere of the terrestrial planets around it, and identify the smoking gun of life, which is, of course, water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, and oxygen. And then once we identify that nearest Earth-like planet, I've also directed NASA in the CJS bill to invest in technology like Dr. Lubin's, the directed energy approach, using directed energy and photon cells. Invest in the fission technology that you just heard described a moment ago that enable us to using hydrogen, I guess, as a gas, accelerating it using uranium depleted. Yeah, right. Uranium-235, I think it'll.
Low enriched.
Right. That, nevertheless, this I've directed NASA with Mo's help to invest in a number of technologies to get us ultimately to, I hope, 10% of the speed of light, and to launch humanity's first interstellar mission to that nearest Earth-like planet no later than July 20th of 2069, the 100th anniversary of Neil Armstrong setting foot on the moon. So that's already been passed by the House. There were no amendments to my bill in subcommittee, committee, or on the floor of the House. And I expect to be able to protect that all the way through the process. Senator Shelby's been a tremendous support and help on this, and it's a natural marriage between these deep space missions, and we'll have not only a very robust human spaceflight program going to the moon and beyond, but also a very aggressive program with a good cadence of discovery, new frontier, and flagship missions out into the future, ultimately leading to humanity's first interstellar mission in 2069.
Thank you very much, Congressman. And next we have leader of Northern Alabama, Mo Brooks. A few opening remarks, please.
Thank you. Just by way of background, I'm the vice chair of the Space Subcommittee of Science, Space, and Technology. And as often is the case, when you follow someone like John, you find out that most of your remarks have been preempted. Okay? There's overlap. He's on the appropriation side, and I'm on the program creation authorization side. So my remarks are going to be significantly different than what you just heard from John. I'm going to take a big turn, and I'm going to talk about America, two Americas, one in the past and one in the future. The one in the past, I think you can make a really compelling argument that America is the greatest nation in world history. And we've held that stature probably for about 70 years. If you look at the strength of our economy, military prowess, the freedoms that we enjoy, I don't know of any other nation in world history that's been able to match that. NASA has been a huge part of the esteem, the aura associated with the United States of America being the greatest nation in world history. 50 years later, we're still the only nation that has been able to put human beings on the moon. That's quite an accomplishment. And when I think back to NASA, I think back to the days I was growing up as a kid down in southwest Huntsville, about 3 or 4 miles away from the Saturn V test stand. And they would do the Saturn V rocket tests, and the ground would shake, the cabinets would reverberate. You'd have to make sure things weren't loose in the cabinets next time you opened because they might be falling out. And then I remember the pride that I had with NASA and what they're able to do when we landed on the moon in 1969, and knowing how our community, had played such a major role in making that accomplishment and in keeping the promise of John F. Kennedy. We continued to be the greatest nation in world history, particularly with respect to space, probably up until around 2010 or so. For safety and financial reasons, the Obama administration canceled the Space Launch System. For primarily financial reasons, they canceled the Constellation system. Fortunately, the Alabama delegation, Texas delegation, and others decided that it was worth the cost, and we, on the heels of the cancellation of Constellation, forced through the Space Launch System. Very similar to Constellation, although different in many ways too. But nonetheless, it showed a renewed commitment to human spaceflight travel by the United States of America and trying to keep us in a preeminent position, a position that we, quite frankly, have been lacking for a number of years now as we have to thumb a ride with the Russians. So the Space Launch System and Orion, we're looking at around 2019 for the first launch of that if we keep on track somewhere in that ballpark. And I think that's going to renew our commitment to space, and I'm anxiously looking forward to the day that that comes. Now, once we get beyond that and we start going to the moon and we start going to Mars, and we'll see where Vice President Mike Pence wants to take us, we should be mindful of a comment by Dr. Werner von Braun, a resident of Huntsville for many years after finally arriving after World War II. Quote, "The greatest gain from space travel consists in the extension of our knowledge. In 100 years, this newly won knowledge will pay huge and unexpected dividends," end quote. We didn't have to wait 100 years. Clearly, we saw that kind of benefit in half a century, and even for that matter, much less than that in the advancement in electronics and other things, human knowledge. Now I'm going to go to the second America, and that second America is the future. And it's going to be in this context. Congressman Dave Schweikert from Arizona made a comment this week. He caught a little bit of flack for it, but he basically stated that Capitol Hill is a math-free zone. Okay? And,
I like that.
well, this is the scary side, and he uttered those words in this context. In 2015, America's deficit was $439 billion. That's math. In 2016, it was a $150 billion deterioration to about $587 billion. This year, it's another $100+ billion deterioration to around a $700 billion deficit, not counting all the hurricane relief monies that were spent before September 30th, the end of the fiscal year. In 2022, the Congressional Budget Office is warning us that we're going to embark on a $1 trillion a year deficit string indefinitely, with 10 years from now it being as bad as $1.4 trillion. The interest on the debt, according to the CBO, is supposed to increase by about $600 billion a year. That's debt service within a decade. Now, that's roughly 30 NASA programs that will be diverted to debt service.
Assuming interest rate don't go up.
That's assuming interest rates don't go up significantly. The Congressional Budget Office, the Government Accountability Office, and the Comptroller General of the United States of America have all warned us that we're on a path toward insolvency and bankruptcy of the United States of America. They do so in writing. They did so in January of this year, and the CBO reiterated it in July of this year. And then I want to emphasize just one thing about the hazards of an insolvency and bankruptcy. Venezuela, they're going through that right now. In Venezuela, I'm just going to mention a few data points. Over the past one recent 12-month period, roughly 75% of their population, about 22 to 24 million people, had an average weight loss of 19 pounds because they can't get the food and the calories to sustain their body weight. That's what happens when you default on your debt. You're seeing what's going on in Puerto Rico. Part of that is because they defaulted on $73 billion. Well, Venezuela, in turn, has defaulted on their debt, and they're in insolvency and bankruptcy. Last year, their inflation rate was approximately 800%. Last year, their GDP dropped about 18 to 19%. And that's what America's looking at. And I mention this financial aspect of it because as we're talking about human space travel, as we're talking about NASA, as we're talking about doing interstellar things, all of that is a function of one thing. Well, two things. One is desire, but the second thing is money. And we have to have a sound central government in order to come up with the money to do the things that we want to do to realize the benefit that Dr. Werner von Braun told us that we would realize if we just invested in this science capability. So as you, many of you are from around the country, as you go back to your home states, I urge you to talk to your senators and your congressmen and to try to get them to understand the financial risk that we're being warned about. And that includes the risk to NASA. That includes the risk to a lot of other things, but right now we're talking about space travel. And to urge them to do what is necessary to get our country back on a sound financial footing before it's too late. So that's the two Americas. One is in the future, it's kind of a forecast, but it's not written in stone. The other is what we have over the last 70 years. I hope that we will make that 70 years, 100 and 150 years, but it requires us to make some good, sound financial decisions today, and it also includes us getting rid of that math-free zone in Washington, D.C.
Thank you very much, Congressman, for those sobering remarks. We have a great American at the end of the table, General Kwast, some opening remarks.
Well, thank you, and thank you for those comments that set this up. I want to get to the question and answer so we can talk about what you want to hear about. But the reason I'm up here is because whenever humanity goes into a new place, if you do not have a cadre of your civilization that are peacemakers, that know how to take advantage of the technologies of the age and the way entrepreneurs and creative human beings move into the future, if you do not have a cadre of people that think about that competitive advantage and that ability to have our values propagate with us into this future, then pirates, thugs, and thieves will steal it away from you, and they will crush all the beautiful investment that uplifts the human condition. This is why I'm here, and this is why I believe in your vision. First of all, I believe in your vision because I believe that the human race will go extinct if it does not take this journey into space, because it's only a matter of time. You know, we live such short lives. If we all could live 2 billion-year lives, we would have a very different perspective on what we are doing here and how we need to be agile and flexible to deal with Mother Nature and how ruthless she can be as history unfolds. The second thing that is important here, though, from a national security perspective is the fact that what we do is we study competitive advantage, meaning that money does matter. If you can do it cheaper than your competition, you will take that high ground. And government is not the only answer. In fact, the answer is the creative spirit of our entrepreneurs that are free to innovate and to move forward. But the government has an important role, just like with the Transcontinental Railway, where entrepreneurs were trying to break through. But a partnership between the government and those innovators made all the difference. The aerospace industry and the airplane is another journey that we see this partnership accelerate the economy of the nation, and that economy can grow us out of these problems. So from a national security perspective, what I see going on here is I see not just America, but America leading the rest of the world into the marketplace of space. And if we do it wisely, we can finally untether our dependence on Earth. And we can reach to the heavens for our energy, for our information, for our manufacturing, for our transportation, in ways that will make the human race uplift the human condition. That is national security right there, because it makes Americans live in peace. It makes Americans live with security. If you have a national security professional with you designing the muscles to defend this space that we take and that we dominate and that we go forward in for peaceful purposes. Because the one common denominator throughout human race is that when somebody achieves dominance in a new domain, they take their values with them. They set the rules. And I'll remind you of the fact that this journey can be dangerous. So China in the 1400s had the greatest Navy in the history of the world. And they made a conscious internal decision because they felt they were so powerful, so strong, the Middle Kingdom. They made a conscious decision to not invest in their Navy. And guess what happened? Portugal happened, Spain happened, England happened, and then the 100 years of humiliation. And they remember that. So what we are watching today is we are watching China building a Navy in space. They are going to put their significant focus financially and intellectually and the billions of people in their society to build this Navy in space. And we are on a track to build buoys in space that can see what's going on but can't do anything about it. This journey needs to have American values. We need to take that high ground first. And the reason, from my perspective as a warfighter, is because everything we have designed since World War II that has made America great is linear in nature. Linear power projection, linear deterrence. Space is a network. It is a ubiquitous network. And the characteristics of a network is that you can deliver power to any node, one node or all nodes, for almost the same price point, versus a linear model where if I do one thing in the South China Sea, it's going to cost me a lot of money and be vulnerable. And if I need to do something in North Korea, it's going to cost me about twice that amount of money. In space, you could do 100 things for about the same price point because it's networked and the way the network flows power and effects. So whoever takes this high ground first, whoever goes into space first, whoever industrializes space first, will be able to hold the rest of humanity under their thumb, or more importantly, under their values. And I sure as hell want American values in that space. And this is why I'm here with you. Thank you. Sir.
Thank you very much, sir. Next, I have a few questions prepared that I'd like to ask and go down the table, ask a couple of questions of each one. Each panelist, I'll ask for a response from each panelist, and then I'll open it up to the other folks on the panel if they'd like to respond. Okay? So the first question is for Paul, and NASA's been a leader in space exploration for the last 75 years. NASA sent 5 spacecraft on trajectories out of the solar system. We've seen a few more that you're proposing right now. In addition to those that you've shown this morning, is NASA working on technologies for interstellar craft?
Yeah, so what I showed you today was just a little bit of, not into the complete picture, but just part of the picture. When you look at the challenges in technology for interstellar or deep space travel, it's fairly straightforward physics, right? It's just very challenging. It's mass, it's velocity, it's the environment, it's space, it's hard. So our investment centers around propulsion technologies. How do you become more efficient? How do you get more thrust? How do you have lightweight structures? How do you have a durable spacecraft? And then how do you, on top of that, layer the instrumentation to achieve the science you want to achieve? All those technology investments are, I'm happy to say, we now have a space technology mission director in the agency. 10 years we couldn't say that. And the investment in there is on the order of $700 million per year. When you break down their technologies, about 20% is innovative propulsion topics, about 15% is, call it game-changing propulsion, and about 10% is really technology demonstrators around propulsion. So I think those are the key technologies. Is the program as rich and robust as we'd like it to be? No, but it's probably about right given the mix of our agency. But I do see that we are now investing in these technologies that are moving us into the outer solar system, into this interstellar environment. That was not the case on the order of 5-10 years ago. So I think we're in a better situation than we were. Is it optimum? No, but we are making significant progress.
Great. Congressman?
Yes, we are. In fact, NASA's, as Paul said, investing in all of these technologies. I in particular, though, want to follow up, if I could, very quickly, and emphasize that Mo is exactly right about the financial future of the United States. The situation is indeed that dire, but it can be solved. We're Americans, and we know how to. We approach this thing with our eyes wide open, we can absolutely solve this. And I want to first point out that the annual appropriations bill represents about 30 cents on the dollar. None of us could ever balance our budget by only looking at the 30 cents on the dollar. The other 70 cents is what's driving this massive increase in the deficit and the debt. That 70 cents is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, principal on the debt, interest on the debt, veterans benefits, and the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. If you're under the age of 45, Social Security is not really there for you. It can only pay about half of the benefits promised to you. If you're 54 years of age or younger, Medicare's hospital fund can only pay 50 cents on the dollar, so it doesn't really exist for you. You solve those two problems, and you have plus with the tax cuts that are being discussed, as the general said, by growing the economy, you solve the looming insolvency of Medicare and Social Security. You cut taxes dramatically so the economy grows. You've really solved a lot of the problems that Mo has laid out. I can't stress enough that it is so important that what Mo has said is fundamentally important to the future of the country, to the future of our prosperity, to the future of the space program, that all of us make the case to everyone we know, our family, our neighbors, our friends, our colleagues, that we have got to solve the looming insolvency of Social Security and Medicare to make the investments that are necessary in the prosperity of the country and in NASA and the space program. And I'd encourage all of you as scientists, as thinkers. I've discovered in my work on the Appropriations Committee, I know Mo has seen this as well, we are devoted to the scientific community. We recognize and will continue to support the efforts at the National Science Foundation, at NASA, to make sure America stays at the cutting edge. But all of you know that scientists have a bad habit of, when we got our grant, do this. Just sort of, okay, that's it, I got mine. It's vital for the scientific community to become advocates for balancing the budget, for solving these looming insolvencies that Mo has talked about, in order for us to be able to make the investments in the far future to make all these wonderful dreams come true. It truly can be done, but we've got to recognize where the root of the problem lies.
Thank you. Congressman?
I have nothing to add to what was already stated
Okay.
on this one.
Yeah, there's a piece of that question, though, that paints a cautionary tone here. And it's about the principle of innovation. As a student of history, when you take a look at civilizations that have been in this same position, where there's not enough money, or the money is questionable, yet the need for innovation is great, the principles generally have very little to do with money. But we can fall into a trap of thinking that money is going to solve it. The perfect example for me as an airman is back in the early 1900s, a man named Samuel P. Langley, who was probably the most celebrated engineer of his time on airplanes, or the potential to fly, was given a tremendous amount of money by the government. And they failed on the one principle of innovation, is that you plant 1,000 seeds and you don't pick winners and losers. You let the innovative spirit of the human mind plant 1,000 seeds and then see which one blooms. And you'll have 99 failures until you find the one that really works. And what happened is Samuel P. Langley failed miserably, and it was two bicycle mechanics out of Dayton, Ohio, that actually invented the airplane. But here's what the government said. In the front page of the New York Times on October 9th, 1903, when Congress took a look at all this money they had given to Samuel P. Langley that was not producing the results, they had their scientists and engineers look at it. And what they said, if we put all of our best mathematicians and engineers on this work of building an airplane, they would figure it out in anywhere between 10 billion and 100, or 10 million and 100 million years from now. That's what the common lexicon and mindset was at how quickly the technology would accelerate. That same day, October 9th, 1903, in the Journal of Wilbur and Orville Wright, it said, "We begin construction today." And 2.5 months later, we had an airplane. So do not underestimate those small companies, that father and son team in Mojave Desert at that spaceport that for $2 million 3D print a rocket and get something into space. It's not always the big programs or the big money that win. It's the big brains and the big ideas. Yes, sir, the American values. So this is why America is so hopeful, because We live this stuff. This is the American spirit. And so there's hope, but we have to be careful.
That's why we're going to conquer this and do this.
Thank you very much. So another question for Paul is, we've seen exponential growth in technologies. It's all over the map, much of it driven by the American industry. But this challenge of going to the nearest planet is much like the general said of common estimates would be it would take hundreds of years to develop the technology. The Congressman has challenged NASA to do it in much less time than that. What do you see as the showstoppers to the technology showstoppers to interstellar travel?
So I don't think there are any showstoppers at this point. I think don't quote me on that.
Yeah, it's just between us.
But I really do think it's doable, okay? And I do think there are innovative ideas out there that we're going to invest in. I think we're going to build off our infrastructure that currently exists, use that in the smartest way possible. We presented to you 3 options today for missions that could move fairly quickly to the interstellar environment. We would have not thought that 5 or 10 years ago. And the expectations are, as we evolve SLS, the infrastructure, the commercial side of our infrastructure, that will all be leveraged to support the interstellar exploration. Again, seeding the way our model in this is a competitive scientific model, right? That's no news to this community, but that really does drive the innovation, and the best ideas rise up and go forth. So is it a technology question? I think we talked about the technology before. It's better propulsion. You can always make a better widget, a lighter structure. The key is the will to go forward, integrating the system, and putting the good science on top of it.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments from the panel?
Well, the only real showstopper is the one Mo mentioned, which we simply have to solve, and that's once you cure the looming insolvency of Social Security and Medicare, once we focus on getting our budget balanced and growing the economy, you really have got the funding that's necessary to make all these things come true, and then focus on unleashing American ingenuity and productivity. As the General said, it's American values that are going to make this happen. Our spirit of innovation and ingenuity is unmatched in human history. I always remember when we had a presentation once, Mo, to the Republican caucus. I forget who it was. I think it was the head of the world, former head of the World Bank. It was appointed by George W., who came in to tell us that when Great Britain and other nations had defaulted on their debt in the past, other countries have been unable to pull out of it because they didn't have the productivity. I had someone from Greece came to see me once. They said everybody in Greece has a job, but nobody works. And the American productivity is unmatched in human history. So the General's exactly right. We solved this big problem of the deficits and the debt, unleash American ingenuity and productivity. There are no showstoppers when it comes to America.
Excellent.
So, sir, I think there is a showstopper if we're not careful, and I think it's culture and bureaucracy. Here's why. Bureaucracy is so powerful because it's just part of the human condition. Where 2 or more people are gathered, there is bureaucracy. And the more people you have, the more bureaucracy. And it's not something to hate. It's actually something good because it perpetuates what has worked. But when what has worked no longer works because your competition has figured out a more cost-effective way, then you need a small group of people that can innovate and then help that culture move forward. So this culture of mindset where the World War II generation gave us a structure and the 1960s gave us a structure for going to space. And that structure then and that idea starts having all kinds of statutory and regulatory calcifications build up around it to protect it and to make it do it the way it's always done it. And people get rich doing it that way. Finding a new paradigm to do it cheaper, faster, better, and smarter threatens the current architecture. It threatens the current people that are getting rich doing good things when there might be another way. So it's not a bad thing that we have bureaucracy and we have culture that perpetuates something that has worked in the past. But the human condition is oftentimes blind to new ways of doing things, and they're frightened of it because oftentimes that new way will threaten the current paradigm. So for me, this is what America has to keep an eye on. that we look for those creative and new ideas. We use the scientific method to measure facts, not our enthusiasm for a program, not our weddedness to that program because of what it's done in the past, but cold, steely-eyed view of the facts and the money and the effectiveness of the decision and the architectural design. If we do that, we will be okay. But if we just cling to our bureaucracy and our culture of how we've done it since 1960, we will not break out into space the way we are capable of in our DNA, as the Congressman alluded to.
I'd like to lead on to that. Do you think the Air Force is capable of fostering these innovative ideas?
Absolutely. I tell you what, and it goes back to the deep faith in the maverick spirit of the American culture. Even though we can get bureaucratic and we can get big and we can get culturally wed to our approaches, the number of people that see this clearly and are ready to innovate are there. But there's something very powerful about the American way of war, and that is that the civilians control the military, okay? So the military has those innovators. They are ready to go, but the power of policy, the power of the purse, and the power of strategy belong to our leaders that are sitting right here. And we will do anything they let us do. And we will move out. So the creative spirit is there, the mavericks are there, the people who know how to innovate, historically know how to innovate faster than our competition are there, but we need the permission to do it.
It does seem like the technologies and the new advances that are coming every day out of Silicon Valley and other places actually lead towards these kinds of investments and the future. So thank you very much, Paul. Would like to ask the Congressman a question. So it's clear from your comments earlier on that the U.S. needs to take a leadership role. But the question is, should we partner? Is this something that the United States should do by itself? Or should we find European or other partners for the interstellar journey?
I think it's fine to partner with the Europeans. They have they've been with us and do very, very good work. Unfortunately, the Chinese government has proven to be one of the most aggressive in the world at frankly stealing intellectual property, and they've been there, as the general says, they have a long-term vision for controlling the high ground of space that is driven by the military. We need to all understand with our eyes wide open that the Chinese space program is owned and controlled lock, stock, and barrel by the People's Liberation Army. They are, of course, a communist nation that is not friendly to us. They have, if you look at the theft of intellectual property, of scientific information, the aggressive intrusions, cyber intrusions into the military, into the government, stealing all of our personal information from every opportunity they get. It's a real problem. So that's why the Commerce Justice Science Bill prohibits NASA from cooperating with China. That's why the Commerce Justice Science Bill requires that every agency under my jurisdiction has to go to the FBI and have any purchase of computer technology or telecommunications technology has to be approved by the FBI as meeting certain minimum standards, and it has to be sure that it doesn't include chips or hardware built in China, because it's unfortunately a terrible problem. So we need to approach this with our eyes wide open, because the general's exactly right. The Chinese are aggressively building a navy in space, and we need to be aware it's not friendly.
So, to paraphrase, we can partner with other folks, or with friendly. I should say
partner
friends.
with our friends.
Partner with our friends and be cautious of others.
Be keenly aware of who's working to bury us long term.
Yeah. Yes.
In that vein, let me be more specific about who friends and foes are. China's been mentioned, but I'd put Russia in the same ballpark. Certainly they're a geopolitical foe. And that's one of the best reasons for the space launch systems, that our astronauts don't have to thumb a ride on Russian rockets. Our geopolitical allies, Japan, India, Australia, Europe, just go down the list. We need to interact with them as much as we possibly can, if for no other reason than that the financial cost is better distributed so that collectively we have more money that in turn can be used to accomplish the missions that we want to accomplish. By way of example, in about 10 days, I'll be meeting with the leadership of the India Space Agency, trying to help discern ways in which we can cooperate further. And we need to foster that as much as we can with nations around the planet that have been long-term peaceful and allies of the United States of America. But I share the concern about China in particular. As their economy continues to boom, before long they're expected to surpass America's economy. Now, I have an economics background, so that's why I focus on that so much. And I see everything that we're doing being a function of our economic wealth. I don't care how innovative you are, if you don't have the money, you can't do it. If you go way, way back, when we were hunter-gatherers, you really didn't have time to do some of the things that you're able to do when you became an agrarian society, or when the Industrial Revolution came around. And every now and then you'll have these lightning bolts of advances with Thomas Edison and the light bulb, or the invention of the transistor I think his name was Farnsworth, or the Wright brothers with the airplane. But more often it's building blocks. These little rockets that were first fired in the 1920s and 1930s later became military weapons a decade later in the 1940s. Later were expanded as military weapons and then started going into space in the 1950s with humans in the 1960s, and we keep building a little bit at a time. And in that vein, that's why I think it's so important that we sincerely pursue the things that we can do now incrementally so that we have a more advanced building block for when we try to do Interstellar. What am I talking about? Things that advance technology like a moon base, going to Mars. Those are more near term in the sense that they're 10 to 20 years away collectively. Capturing capturing asteroids when we can to discern whether it really is a potential for mining space and is it economically feasible. But building blocks is most likely the way that we're going to get there, although if we can get another lightning bolt, if we can use lasers by way of example where's your satellite you had in your pocket?
Here, sir.
Okay, if we can use lasers to propel this satellite, that's a lightning bolt type of thing, and we need to invest monies to do that, but we also need to do the building block one step at a time approach too.
So NATO allies, major non-NATO allies of the U.S. is who we should focus on.
Who we believe are peaceful.
Yes.
And freedom-loving. I mean, that's the basics. Not people who long-term may use, hopefully they won't, but there's a risk that they may use the technology in a warlike manner.
Certainly. General?
Yeah, so I agree with those sentiments. I'll tell you, though, as you study civilizations, the last 22 civilizations of at least recorded history, and you look at these sine waves of behavior that are consistent with human nature, of being born in vigor, recognizing the need for security, the economic might that makes that security something that's sustainable, and then they get lazy and they get arrogant and then they get vanquished by another civilization. These are common to the human condition and will always happen. But in those journeys, if you work together with other people, you have a fighting chance of surviving. And if you believe there are more people on this globe that love their children and want to work out the differences of civilization without killing each other, then if we come together, we can push evil out of this world. But I also believe, though, that America has a unique competitive advantage culturally that no other culture on planet Earth has to the same degree, and that is this ability to be a leader in innovation. I think the Chinese are fast followers. I think culturally they are very good at fast following, and they steal, cheat, and rob you to do it in many cases. But Americans are natural leaders. So that's what I want to build on. Clever people can cooperate even with somebody who is potentially going to try to use it as a weapon against us. But if we're clever and we are the leaders, we'll be okay.
Thank you, sir. Congressman Culbertson, is the public ready to support a probe beyond the edges of the solar system as a step towards crossing interstellar distances? Will they really have the attention span to follow out to 2069?
I think absolutely. If you look at the web visits of, for example, whenever NASA has a seminar on exoplanets, whenever the scientific community has a seminar or a talk about exoplanets, they generally melt down the website. They have tremendous interest among the public and the scientific community, more so on exoplanets than almost any other subject. And the discovery of life in the oceans of Europa, which I'm convinced will happen, will, as I mentioned, I'm convinced, throw a switch in the mind of the public, electrify public opinion, and the human imagination, I'm convinced, people will make the investments and support NASA at the level that's necessary to make the investments to go on to send humans to Mars, and to, when we make that discovery using Starshade and WFIRST, or that nearest Earth-like planet, with evidence of life. John Grunsfeld told me that he believes it would even be possible to see industrial pollution in the atmosphere. Yes, absolutely. I think that the public will support the mission, particularly if we're able to get to, as I've written into my bill, using a variety of technologies, investing in a whole variety of technologies to get to the point ultimately where we're at achieving at least 10% of the speed of light, so that it does become achievable, Paul, in a human lifespan. Yes, I think so. Absolutely.
Other panelists, do we have the...
I think it's going to be a little bit more challenging than that, and I'll give you some examples. We had a congressman from New York by the name of Grimm, and money's always an issue. And for the first 3 or 4 years I was in Congress, I was first sworn in January 2011, he would annually introduce an amendment, and John probably remembers this, and that amendment would be to take $200 to $300 million from NASA to put into local police departments. And that amendment would win year after year after year. Now, fortunately, or unfortunately as the case may be, none of our appropriations bills ever became law. Okay, we would end up with a continuing resolution or an omnibus, something of that nature. But we hope now that they will be. He's a good optimist. But when I see those kind of votes, and they'd be close votes, but NASA is a uniquely national program.
Right.
Cities, counties, and states can't do NASA, space exploration. Law enforcement is a uniquely local program. But nonetheless, we were shifting monies, $200–300 million at a time, with our House floor votes, from a national program like NASA to law enforcement that should be a function of city and county and state governments. And so what I'm trying to emphasize here is that our challenge is great. It's achievable, but we've got to put our shoulder to the wheel, and we've got to push, and we've got to make sure that we have the votes in the United States Congress, that we don't have just some people in the public who are gung-ho on this, but that we have a majority that is gung-ho on this. And in that vein, I mentioned I'm vice chair of the space subcommittee on science, space, and technology. We get these flow charts every now and then that talk about all these different programs that NASA has had that we spend a lot of money on, and then they get canceled. They might get canceled because of the differing views of Congress, or they might get canceled because of the differing views of the executive branch. And in particular, they might get canceled because it turned out that those were really good ideas, but the technology was not yet there to fulfill them. And the result of these cancellations is, from a marketing standpoint, when you're talking to the public, they see all these ambitious things that NASA has tried to do over the last 20 or 30 years that we have zero to show for it, except to the extent that, when you run an experiment and you don't get the right results, you know not to do that experiment again. Then you try a different experiment. And we've got to do a much better job of having the perseverance, if we're going to start a program, to actually see it through, financially most importantly, to the end game, so that we have that next advancement, that next program successfully in space, and we have something to show for it, which in turn buttresses the citizens willing to invest in it. And a really good example that you're all familiar with would be cancellation. The money we spend on cancellation, then to have it canceled. just 5-6 years ago, whatever the time frame was. The public sees those kinds of things, and we've got to stop this half-hearted effort. If we're going to do it, we need to be all in and get it done successfully, which in turn is what the public is looking for as a return on their investments.
If I could very quickly, Mo's exactly right about that. That's why these things that I've described to you in the appropriations bill have been written into law. Constellation was canceled because it was not written into law. You've got, of course, the Constitution, federal law enacted by Congress, and then a presidential, Supreme Court opinions or presidential executive orders. Constellation was canceled by our president because it had not been written into law. The things that I've described to you have been signed into law in the appropriations bill, and they're there, and they cannot be canceled by executive order or any president.
We need John to stay in that position for a while.
Thank you.
Yeah, so Pete, if I could add a little bit to the answer. So the question is, how can we maintain and sustain this energy and then make sure that the public is engaged in the future for interstellar exploration? So what we do as a leadership team at Marshall, at the agency level, our accountability is delivery of our products and making sure that we execute the mission per our funding come from Congress and our guidance from the White House. What that means to me in my day job is that in 2019, we see commercial crew flying in either SpaceX or Orbital ADK, so when NASA moves out of low Earth orbit, we then buy cargo and launch services for humans as a commercial service moving out of deep space. That's a product delivery that we can deliver to the nation, and then they say, hey, we are making progress as an agency. Big in 2019 also is James Webb Telescope. Okay, when the nation sees James Webb launch and unfold, and believe me, it's an origami at L2. It'll be an amazing spacecraft. And on top of that, SLS Orion launch in 2019. So my answer to your question is, we as an agency need to deliver on our products and achieve the expectations of the Congress and the people of the United States.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Sir, all of these I agree with. I would say that the underlying condition here I would couch as leadership. And one of the things that good leaders are good at doing is they are good at putting the important in front of the urgent. So the example of the money going from NASA to the local government, that is an urgent problem. But when you take a look at the American society and our perpetuation and the human race and our perpetuation, that's important. And this is why the groundswell of conversation is so important here. If we can inspire America and the rest of the world, that we can solve our problems with our environment, we can solve our problems with our energy dilemmas, we can solve our problems with the human condition and uplifting it so that this pale blue dot is wholesome and a place people can live and breathe deeply. You now start putting the important in front of the urgent in a way that funds it with sustainability that allows innovation to take us to places we could otherwise not go. It's leadership.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Moving on to Congressman Brooks. Humans have been exploring from the beginning of time, and the U.S. has a strong tradition of exploration and settlement of the New World. Do you think it's important for humanity to leave the planet?
Well, when you say humanity, I assume you're talking about parts of us, not all of us.
Well, I've got a list of people I'd like to.
All right. It's a part of the human condition, exploration. The knowledge that we gain, the sense of accomplishment that we gain, it's been that way, I think, from the beginning of our time as human beings on this planet. To the extent that we can go to the moon and Mars, we need to. To the extent we can develop the technology to go beyond our solar system, we need to. And when I use the word need, I'm talking about it being a part of the human condition. It's just built into us. Now, perhaps not all of us, but some of us, the explorers, and then the rest of us follow on their heels. So yes, I agree with that.
General?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that, there's two principles of war that keep the peace. One is agility, and the other is flexibility. And for the human race, the agility and flexibility to be able to deal with some event that might happen, whether it's an asteroid coming at us, whether it's a biological or chemical dynamic that takes place on the Earth that threatens the human race. Our ability to have the agility and flexibility to operate as a human race, whether on the Earth, on any other planet, or in space, is going to be important in time. And the sooner we get on that journey, the more potential we have to survive. So I think in time there is a need to be able to not use Mother Earth as our home if required. How quickly we get there, the quicker we get there, the more agility and flexibility we have as an American race and a human race. And in the short run, it grows our economy, which gives us national security, which gives us the ability to uplift the human condition in America.
Great. Paul?
So I'm not ready to give up on Earth yet. I kind of like her for a while, so but
You kinda like it.
I am willing to send my daughters or my daughter's daughters.
Well, the transatlantic be in space, or we got to have something with us.
But I do agree that human exploration is in our genes. Okay, it's a part of who we are, and being in space is part of our future. I cannot tell you, when I look at the next generation folks working at Marshall, working across the agency, they're excited about it's their chance to go to space, and I think you'll see that in their lives. You'll see it in their kids, their children's lives. When I look at human exploration, it is a tip of the spear of a larger challenge that this nation has, that's been alluded to here, and that's the need for a space infrastructure. I think you see commercial folks moving forward to a low Earth orbit space infrastructure. That's a huge benefit for us at the competitive level that supports our national security and supports the NASA vision. So I think human exploration is one means to help us achieve this larger infrastructure in space, which will then support national security, science, and human exploration. So I think it's just one part of the story of our future.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Congressman Brooks, I think we've heard the astronomical costs, and we've heard the challenges there. So I'd like to move on to the technologies. The technologies that Breakthrough has been discussing for interstellar travel is the largest lasers ever conceived of on the planet. And of course, those have dual uses. How do you think the government should react to the developments of a private organization discussing and investing in these technologies? What's an appropriate response for the government?
Well, personally, as someone who's concerned about our financial condition, I love it when it's in the private sector. When people are investing and risking their own capital with the potential reward being determined by how well that investment pays off and the technological advances that they're able to accomplish. So I see a significant role in the private sector. The challenge, though, is the magnitude of the costs are such that you have very limited private sector participation. Now, when I'm talking about private sector, I'm talking about where they do it all. They pay for the financing of it. They pay for every aspect of it without the government being involved in it. But I do see a role for partnerships when you've got something of this magnitude, something that the private sector typically cannot do. So SpaceX, by way of example, Blue Horizon, all these private sector, and I say all, there's probably only about 3 or 4 when you really get down to it, as major players. I think we ought to encourage that, but at the same time, we have to understand their limitations. After all, they are in it not necessarily for scientific advancement. Their shareholders are looking for a return on investment, a profit at some point. And so it's the federal government that has to, in particular, focus on the basic research, the basic science, for which we don't expect any short-term profit, and for that matter, even long-term profit. And that's why I think that you're going to see the federal government, to the extent we have the financial ability, continue to play a key role in, for example, capturing an asteroid, or going to the moon, or going to Mars. In time, if there's some way some private entity can successfully turn a profit off of our first steps, then that's great. And you've seen that. 1960s, move on to satellites, and how there is a commercial profit to be made by being in that sector when there was not a commercial profit to be made in the 1960s. So hopefully as we continue to advance, the private sector can follow up on those advancements and we can spread the cost around. And as we spread the cost around, we get more entities involved, which in turn will advance our technologies.
Sir, the Breakthrough Foundation is actually investing without a profit motive. It's a philanthropic approach. What I'm worried about is we're building these gigantic machines that have other uses, and I don't know what the appropriate response from the federal government should be.
I need you to be a little bit more specific when you're talking about we're building these gigantic machines. Are you talking about the Space Launch System, or are you?
No, I'm talking about. So Breakthrough has plans to build 100 gigawatt lasers on the ground. These are machines that are capable of incinerating satellites in seconds, and we're a little worried about the policy implications of those kinds of facilities being in the hands of private individuals. Right.
I would need more insight on that one before I would be in a position to express an opinion.
If I could, a part of that is that, number one, if a directed energy laser of that type would be a deadly weapon if it was in orbit, if it could be directed at the Earth, is a real concern. I think that's what Bo's talking about. But another aspect of this that causes me real concern is and we are, both of us, and there's tremendous support in Congress for the idea of a Yellow Pages test. If you can find a service in the private sector that the government does, you should privatize it if you can, and that's a good thing. However, when I met with Elon Musk, he mentioned to me that he was planning to land 5 metric tons on Mars in 2018. Not sure he'll hit that. I mean, it's an ambitious and lofty, noble goal. That's terrific, but I asked him, what are you going to do planetary protection if you land near a wet spot? He wasn't overly concerned about that, which really alarmed me, and that he wanted to get to Europa and get into the ocean. I think the private sector has a vital role in low Earth orbit, and it's marvelous. We should encourage a Homestead Act for space, but we have to insist that private providers, private commercial space operators ensure planetary protection, that we don't carry Earth organisms to the European oceans or to Mars.
Would you imagine that is done through NASA or through the Air Force? Or?
I think it's going to have to be done through NASA. I think that's actually something we have to look at, Mo, is ensuring that the private providers aren't carrying, that they're actually sterilizing these spacecraft at the same levels that NASA does in JPL, for example. That's one of the reasons they burned up Cassini in the orbit, in the atmosphere of Saturn, was for planetary protection.
As a condition of the launch license, probably.
Yeah, exactly. The Europa lander, for example, will self-immolate. It will incinerate itself after it completes its mission to ensure that it doesn't leave any Earth organisms on the surface of Europa.
Thank you. General, do you have any comments?
This journey takes a lot of wisdom, and there's two components, I think, to your question. The one component is, does government have a role to play? And yes, it does. For example, when the automobile was invented, most people didn't have the money to build roads to go where they needed to go. The government helped with that, and it created an economy where cars could then, you have gas stations popping all over the place, our Eisenhower interstate system. So government has a role to play at building the roads or the highways to allow people to connect and businesses to thrive. And in this case, the sweet spot is the highway to space. If the government can help us have an affordable highway to space, no matter how that manifests, and it will manifest in steps, chemical propulsion initially, but maybe other propulsion that makes it more affordable, the government can play a role. The other is regulatory, and then the weapon piece is another one, because every weapon, whether it was the invention of the crossbow or the phalanx or the airplane or the nuclear weapon, you can't put the genie back in the bottle sometimes, and then you need other ways of dealing with that. Deterrence, reassurance, the power of the economy to have national security and power projection. These are all complicated things, delicate balances, and the wisdom of our Congress to be able to regulate wisely so they don't snuff out innovation but they also allow us to, not destroy Europa or other places. This requires science, it requires policy advice, and it requires the wisdom of Job. Good luck with that, sir.
Thank you, sir. This is a question for General Kwast. In the mid-20th century, the U.S. Air Force developed the most sophisticated technologies on the planet, from breakthroughs in lasers to the stealth and amazing SR-71. How can the U.S. Air Force remain relevant in today's environment of rapid innovation and information-centric decision-making?
Yeah, so I'll keep this one short because it's by following the principles of history and human nature that have made us be able to do that same thing in the past. So these principles are, the principles of innovation, and getting a small group of people together that can work outside the bureaucracy to develop capabilities, plant 1,000 seeds and fund them consistently so you can see when they fail. And it's not failure, it's discovery, and you discover faster than your competition. And then when you stumble on the one that's game-changing, then you invest in that and you use it. It's about concepts where you look at different ways of architecting power projection. We know these principles of human nature on how to innovate rapidly. There's no question about it. So yes, we can be relevant. We are relevant. If you take a look at the entire spectrum of what we're doing, we are being relevant. But we have the opportunity here, and this is where this crowd comes in important. We have an opportunity here where we're on the edge of greatness, where we now have a president and vice president who have just articulated a policy shift in the way we go to space. And if we jump on board that opening, that political opening, where we have a president that wants to change the game in the American economy, exploding into space, the industrialization of space, and human beings in space permanently, if we take that train and ride it, we can do amazing things.
Okay, so the last comment, and then I'd like to open the microphone to questions from the floor. For the general, how do we train young men and women to be leaders in a Facebook, Google type world? How can the Air Force learn from or partner with these new technology companies?
Yeah, so this is my job. As the commander of Air University, I'm in charge of all education for our Air Force. And so we do this the same way we know how to do it through history. Socrates, Aristotle, all the great teachers of our human race have taught us how to teach our young. And what we do is we teach the habits of mind that make somebody a good leader. We teach them the values and the beliefs that are consistent with our Constitution and our respect for every other human being, no matter who they are or where they come from. We stay consistent to these things, and then we teach them to think critically, think strategically, think culturally, collaboratively, have them think contextually and conceptually. All these things that make you good as a leader, of recognizing the geostrategic environment you are living in, understanding human nature, and understanding the technologies that have always been a tool of national power. Teach them how to innovate, how to collaborate with others, how to listen, how to be humble, and not get arrogance and pride in the way of effective progress. This is what we do, and we start when they're in diapers. We start when they're young, where their minds are fertile and malleable, and we teach them how to learn. We teach them how to think. We don't teach them what to think. We teach them how to think. And when they learn how to learn, and they get on fire with their intellectual curiosity, and we help them understand how you'll use fact-based scientific method for discovery, not your ego, your pride, even your past, then we'll be on a road to success. And that's what we're doing as we speak.
Thank you very much, panelists. I'm humbled by the great words we've heard, but would like to hear some questions from the audience now.
It will be. Yes. Okay. Pontus Brandt, APL, the place behind the New Horizons Pluto flyby, and also we're launching Parker Solar Probe next year. Yay, finally. And also, we've been involved in the Interstellar Probe mission definition for decades now. Just first, one tiny detail. The number 13 AU per year was tossed out, and the distance to Alpha Centauri, that will take us 21,240 years, not 200 years. My question is to Congressman Culbertson here. So, having been through a couple of mission developments now, the goal of 2069 makes me sweat. So I would like to hear your view on intermediate mission steps to achieve that goal. Are we doing that all in one big swoop, or are we doing it in steps? What's your view on that?
The idea is to let NASA scientists like yourself guide us in that. It's, I think, vitally important for Congress, for our leadership to set those goals and do our very best to achieve them. I had yet to see a blueprint, long-term blueprint at NASA, and I felt it was important just to set that goal and push very hard and make sure the funding was there and the stability for the long term. As Mo mentioned, he's exactly right. You can't have presidents coming in and canceling these things. So these things are written into law, and the money is there. And by the way, the amendment he mentioned, those guys that keep trying to take money from NASA and send it down to local government, did not offer those amendments this time. I used a variety of things to help make sure that won't happen.
Also, the guy who is pushing those amendments has since been convicted.
Yeah, he's gone. But yeah, he's gone. But those amendments were very common. We used to get those every single year, taking money from NASA and sending it down to local government. And there's just nevertheless, we are all of us working arm in arm to make sure that NASA's got the funding and the stability and the focus for the future to make sure these things happen. We're counting on you to help us figure out how to get there, all of you.
Cool. My name is Michael Mealing, Starbridge Venture Capital. To kind of riff on something that General said about the history of how we explore. Actually the majority of the voyages of exploration from 1450 up to the 1700s were privately financed, privately crewed, privately built. In today's world, we have corporations and family offices that are older than our country. What Yuri is doing with the Breakthrough Starshot, and what other organizations and family offices around the world are currently doing, spending money for profit in some cases, and not for profit in other cases. Are there thoughts within Congress, for example, zero G, zero tax, extending changes on rules against perpetuities, that enable long-term thinking in the private sector so that the burden of developing some of these missions is not solely on the government?
It's a great question. I know that Mo's committee you passed essentially like a Homestead Act for space a year or so ago. Didn't you? Could you describe that? That was a great bill. I know you had a hand in.
That is one of the debates we have on a regular basis in Congress. I can give you my viewpoint. To the extent there are private sector interests who want to engage in any kind of space exploration, I want the federal government to get out of their way.
Yep.
Okay?
Absolutely.
That's my view. Now, sometimes because of financial resources or other limitations, there is a need for federal government approval, or there is a need for the use of federal government land and equipment, like the launch sites in Florida. And I believe the federal government should do everything we can to assist with the availability of our facilities, so long as that private sector is willing to contribute whatever their fair share of the cost of maintenance and operation of those facilities should be, so that we're not giving one private sector entity a competitive advantage over another by helping one and not helping the other. So we need to have a level playing field. But historically, the private sector has done a great job of advancing the human condition, whether it be with medicine, whether it be in any number of sciences, and for that matter, most recently with the improvements that we've seen in satellite capabilities and what they can do for telecommunications. I'm a firm believer in the private sector. So you let me know what I can do as one of the authorizers on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, and I'll see if we can get that done.
One thing we could do is encourage private companies to, for example, find ways to, if they can use the space station or the space structure that Paul described that NASA will be building in the vicinity of the moon at L2 for innovative vaccines or medicines that the private sector could then make a significant profit on, because right now the commercial sector is essentially hauling freight. And NASA's job is to, again, provide, as the general said, we need to think of interplanetary and interstellar as NASA's job, the interplanetary highway system. We've got to find a way to get beyond just hauling freight. You can't make that much money hauling freight. We've got to find out how to let the private sector really make a significant profit in space.
I agree, and I would just simply suggest that the federal government does best when it acts as an anchor tenant and not as a landlord.
Anchor tenant, I like that. That's right. That makes sense.
Well, I'm Bill Gardner from Analytech Commercial Analytical Chemical Testing Laboratory in suburban Atlanta in Clayton County. You've heard of Clayton County. You can't avoid coming and seeing us because it's the home of Atlanta Hartsfield International Airport. But so today I've come here to see you, Congressman Brooks, Culbertson, Dr. McConnaughey, and General Kwast. The headlines this week say, why? And I'm going to ask you, why not give the NASA human spaceflight, I had to write this down to make sure I get it right. Why not give the NASA Human Spaceflight Health and Medical Division the mission of developing a new vital sign test like blood pressure and pulse that will solve the problem of identifying mental health issues before they become lethal?
John, you're the senior congressman. Do you want to take that first?
Well, one of the things that our subcommittee has funded for a number of years is the BRAIN Initiative at the National Science Foundation, because understanding how the human mind works is one of the greatest challenges we face. And it's an ongoing and immensely complicated problem. The catastrophe we saw in Las Vegas is an unfathomable tragedy, and mental illness is a massive problem, and one that not just NASA but the National Institute of Health and the National Science Foundation need to continue to invest in and work on. And we've been very strong supporters of that.
On this one because it's very powerful. And this is part of the story. You all can help infect the entire country. Just looking at the scientific advantages, if we had an industry in space where you could do scientific discovery in space that you could never do in the terrestrial and the well of gravity, is powerful. Let's take the hurricanes, for example. Solar power from space that can destabilize the eye of the hurricane so that it does not become a level 5. Or people that are in disaster areas can get energy from space instead of having to have no infrastructure for weeks and months where people die and starve and so on. So the ability to uplift humanity, not only in the sciences and in the health that you can do in space that you cannot do on the Earth, and the ability to help humanity from space, something as simple as a hurricane not becoming a level 5. Now, I don't know what the second and third order effects would that be if we didn't have level 5 hurricanes, category 5 hurricanes coming on shore anymore. But look at look at what you could do. That's the real story across all sectors of the human condition.
Exactly. Thank you. That's the answer I was looking for.
I'd certainly like to thank the panel for wonderful insights. I'm John Rather, and I did time at 3 national labs and vice president of an aerospace company, and most of the 1990s at NASA headquarters in the senior executive service, and so I've sort of seen it all. I was particularly inspired by General Kwast's enthusiasm for innovation, and there's a vital thing that wasn't mentioned, I think, and that's the necessity to accommodate failure, because I remember vividly I was 19 years old 60 years ago today out before dawn looking for Sputnik coming over, and the whole country was panicking because we'd failed twice to beat the Russians, and General Eisenhower had the wisdom to appoint General Bernard Schriever as director to get the ICBMs deployed. He immediately convened a panel of the brightest people he could find, and John von Neumann told him what to do, and he did it. And the way we caught up and overcame the Russians was to fail repeatedly. The first 20 times we launched the Atlas, it failed before it got out of the atmosphere, but 1 launch per month or quicker, and we learned very fast how to do it right. And the same spirit existed in the national labs. Young guys like I was 80 years ago were permitted to fail routinely. You'd have 10 ideas fail 9 times, the 10th one would be a big breakthrough. So we have to learn to accommodate failure and to understand it and promulgate that as part of what really reaches for the future. Thank you.
Yes, sir. So that is culture right there. Risk aversion is culture. And you're right. It's not failure, it's discovery. That's what North Korea is doing right now. He's discovering rapidly, and it's not good. But we have to, as a society, and from the government to individuals, we have to be willing to take risk. As a person in the art of war, my job is to stay one step ahead of the enemy. The only way I do it is by taking more risk than my enemy. But it has to be prudent risk, and it has to be clever risk. So it's a delicate balance, but if you're afraid, if you have any fear, and if you have risk aversion baked into your heart because you've lived your life too comfortably, you are no good at being an innovator.
That's right. Thank you.
All right, well, I'd like to thank our panelists and thank you all for being here. Thank you so very much.